A man and a fish walk into a bar, and they're talking with each other, and the man says to the fish, I woke up this morning, and then I walked outside and took such a refreshing breath of fresh air. It was just amazing. And the fish looked at him and said, well, of course, you mean water. And what this story is intended to draw out, of course, is that we interpret things and that we understand things in the context of our worldview. The fish's worldview is one that is dominated by and is understood through the lens of being surrounded by water. And so for a fish, of course, breathing means water, not air. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's very easy for us to imagine other beliefs. If I told you that, the lottery numbers 0 through 10 were like 9, 7, 8, 3, then it's very easy for you to imagine that they weren't in fact 9, 7, 8, 3, it was 9, 7, 8, 4. Because of the options that are available to us in terms of belief, we understand that there are other things that could have happened but may not be the case. If it's raining outside and I believe that it's raining outside, then I understand that as part of the set of options that are available to me. It's very easy for me to understand that it's either raining or not raining outside. However, it is much harder for us to understand other worldviews. And so beliefs, yes, okay, we can choose from the buffet of what it is that we might or might not believe with respect to whatever it is that we're doing. But worldviews are a very different story. How does someone understand themselves, the world, the relationship between themselves and the world, the relationship between themselves and the divine, what they can see, what they can't see, what is sacred, what is profane? All of these things comprise a portion of the way that we understand the world, metaphysics, in a way that is hard to communicate, if not impossible to communicate to other people. And it's something that we can't just say, okay, well, I understand that I believe that this number is 9, but you believe that the number is 8. We're on the same playing field there. When it comes to worldviews, we're not on the same playing field. We're not viewing the world in the same way. And that structures the way that we understand reality itself, the way that we understand ourselves in being a part of reality. Those are the things that are different with respect especially to the origins of philosophy and what we should be thinking about in trying to imagine what Thales was talking about, what Anaximander was talking about, and all of the others going through in a very different society. And this is the trouble when people think about different philosophies. They might think about, I pejoratively call this the philosophical buffet, where people treat philosophical theory as though it was a buffet of options. And you just go in there and you take the pieces that you like. It's like, okay, I like this kind of salad, I like this kind of sauce, and I'm going to put it all together and create the perfect mix that tastes the best to me. In other words, if it is a matter of taste, then it appeals to me the most in a certain way. That is completely different than worldview understanding. And this is ultimately what I tell my students when it comes to trying to understand other philosophical systems. I don't want you to just understand their arguments. I don't want you to just understand the logic. We're not learning mathematics here. Well, to some extent, anyway. We're trying to understand how other people think. And so I want you to understand how it is that their worldview, how it is that what they approach the world by and the things that they were likely to say and do, how it is that those make sense in the context of a certain mode of being, a certain mode of living. And that is quite different than just trying to understand logically what a particular statement means. So when someone tries to understand Thales' pronouncement that all is water, oftentimes we try to understand this through the lens of what is already familiar to us. In other words, we try and domesticate that statement by turning it into something that we can understand and making it something that is similar in kind to the buffet of options that we already understand as being available. So if I already understand that it's possible to have a certain kind of physical theory, in other words, the range of what counts as a physical theory is something that I already kind of have in the back of my mind, and when somebody tells me Thales had a different physical theory, then I tend to understand it in that context of, okay, well, he must have chosen from one of the options that is available that I understand as being a part of the range of what acceptable physical theory can be. And so this is like telling someone, I have a new paper in physics. I have a new kind of physics. And they're going to say, okay, does that count as physics? This is one of the questions that people have had and have raised with respect to, much to the consternation of, string theory and string string theorists. So string theory was looked down upon for a long time because it was regarded as not creating predictions. It was not creating something that could be testable. In other words, it violated the Popperian notion, so Karl Popper in the 20th century, of falsifiability. If it was something that we can't test and determine whether it's right or wrong, then the argument goes it's not a proper physical theory. In other words, they were saying that string theory, even though it had all kinds of mathematics associated with it and all kinds of speculations, and it was very interesting in certain ways, the argument was that it couldn't count as a physical theory because it was not testable. It was not falsifiable. In other words, the version of what they thought physical theory was did not include something like string theory among the range of possibilities. Now, the reason why we interpret things like this may be even more interesting. And so I'm thinking in particular of an essay by Mark Twain where he talks about destiny and the idea that we tend to interpret history and we tend to interpret things as though all of human history was leading up to its culminating moment, its apex, which of course is right here, right now with me. And that we have this very, it's kind of narcissistic, right, view of human history and wanting to interpret all events as though they led up to whatever it is that might happen to have occurred. Now, this is not only in terms of thinking that, yay, I'm so great. We also do this in terms of any given coincidence. So anytime I have something good or bad happen in my life, it's very easy for me to believe a story, a narrative about how it is that previous events were, inevitably leading up to that particular end. And so we're inclined to believe stories like that. And that in itself is kind of interesting. But this creates a myopia when it comes to trying to understand other worldviews. It's something where we have a genuine shortcoming in trying to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. So this is a theory of mind question. In other words, how can I understand what you are seeing and thinking? So if I know that you're behind an obstacle and you can't see through that obstacle, then I know you're not going to be able to see things that are on the other side of the wall. That's a theory of mind kind of basic sort of thing. Or if something happens after you leave the room, then you're not going to know about it unless someone has told you. That's another theory of mind type situation. Well, ultimately, the big picture version of this is theory of mind in terms of imaginative horizon. So how it is that we are thinking in general, which includes not only the information that we have, the possible beliefs, in other words, just the range of possibilities there that we talked about in terms of what counts as physical theory or what can be a belief, but also in terms of worldview, in terms of our own metaphysics, how we understand ourselves, how we understand other people, reality, etc., etc. And so that, I think, is what is so profoundly different and causes people so much consternation in trying to understand the pre-Socratics, is because they had a very different worldview that had gods and goddesses, and it had animating principles in life, and the self was different, and virtually every aspect of reality for them was different in a significant way than what we have today. And I try to impress this upon people when we're talking about polytheism, because polytheism in any given traditional society that is polytheistic is going to have a view on the world that is substantially different than the one that we have now. And so we try to interpret this in terms of beliefs as though we can just change items on the buffet and now we have polytheism. So instead of one god, we have many gods. What does that look like? What does it feel like? That's how we're trying on these other clothes, these other systems. But in fact, the differences are much more fundamental than that. Take, for example, Thales' assertion that magnets have soul. And this is something that people look at and oftentimes will say, oh, well, ha ha ha, they move on their own or move without actually interacting physically with another item. And so he must have assumed that they had a kind of life force. That is a reductionist way of thinking about it, and one that assumes, unfortunately, and this is one of the things that it's kind of a pet peeve of mine when people talk about the pre-Socratics, is to speak about them as though they were infantile versions of scientists, as though they were just childlike versions of what ultimately will come to fruition in maturity with us and the way that we think, as though any difference must be explained as being a kind of predecessor. Do you hear the same thing, right? This is that story. This is that narrative where it's very easy for us to believe a narrative such that all things that came before us were just leading towards us, and they were inchoate. They weren't perfectly formed, but ultimately the mature form is coming, and that's going to be us. It's very easy for us to believe that, and that version of the story, which says that, oh, well, Thales is say, proto-scientist. He's just not really fully a scientist yet, but he's kind of getting there. Like, we want to give him a gold star for trying. And that is it's a condescending, but also a very myopic way of viewing the situation, and it's not necessary to view it that way. So with magnets, the animating principles. So Thales saw and understood animating principles in the way that we would get, for instance, not much earlier with Homer. And so the Homeric shades were understood as part of the underworld. These are not immortal souls in the way that we often think about them now. So the Homeric shades were not full people in the way that we think about now. Their notion of self was not the same. And so when they thought about a soul, it was more just what gives something motion. So basic metaphysics, you've got stuff, and then some stuff seems to kind of move on its own. And whatever the animating principle of that stuff is, that's what gives it soul. And so for the Romans in particular, so let's take the Latin version of this because I think it makes it really obvious. So our word animate, so the animation of something, which means giving it motion. Animation, that word comes from anima, and anima is the Latin for soul. And so that's where, motion, soul. Something that has a soul is something that has a principle of motion, an internal principle of motion. And so the idea for Thales to say that magnets have souls, well, that's not really that much more interesting than to say that they have a principle of motion. They're moving. Well, obviously they're moving. So that statement is not so much proto-science. It is not so much as interesting as people often take it to be. It's just simply a statement of how it is that they use the word, how it is that they thought of souls as animating principles. And so anyway, I think that helps to demystify some of what's going on there. But it also antagonizes the idea that he was doing science in a way that we would recognize. And the other thing that I want to address with this is the notion that all is water. So people oftentimes, if you hear nothing else about Thales, you're likely to hear the assertion that all is water. And he was doing physical theory like these are, as Aristotle would later say, the physikois, so the natural philosophers, those who were thinking about physis, nature. So physis is the ancient Greek word for nature. And so these were the people who were trying to understand nature. Well, this is because Aristotle, several centuries later, was already much closer to us. And so he was helping us to try and interpret things in that same sort of narrative. In other words, he thought of the pre-Socratics as leading up to him in the same way that we think of the pre-Socratics and Aristotle as leading up to us. So he's participating in that same kind of reductive story, which is unfortunate in a certain way. So he was not sympathetically interpreting the pre-Socratics, which is what we get. A lot of what we know about the pre-Socratics comes from people like Aristotle and arguably what are fairly clear myopic misunderstandings in some way. So he was not giving them full credit for having ideas that were comparable with his. He was seeing them as infantile forms of what would ultimately become his. And because of that, accused them of making several rather simplistic mistakes, that if they were Aristotelians, then yes, they would be simplistic mistakes. But on their own, considered properly on their own, in other words, within their own imaginative horizons, within the context of their own metaphysics, then they were not mistakes in the same way. They were very different world systems. They were very different ways of seeing the world. And so all is water. I want to propose to you that contra what it is that we hear from Aristotle, that the different physikoi, the different people who were considering theories of nature, in saying that with Thales all is water, with Anaximenes all is air, Heraclitus we get fire, and as if they're just kind of going through the elements. And then, of course, with Anaximander, we have the apeiron, which is the indefinite. And it's like, okay, we have all these different possibilities. We'll put that in our bucket of things that can be, proper physical theories. That's the way that Aristotle was thinking about it. This is really not an appropriate way of interpreting the pre-Socratics, because that's not what was going on. They were not trying to create physical theory in a way that would be commensurate with what Aristotle was doing, and certainly not in a way that would be commensurate with what we are doing. And so what they are closer to, I would propose to you as food for thought, these physical theories were actually different forms of monotheism. In other words, they are different ways of understanding the world in terms of single principles that govern not only the physics of the world, not only nature, but also the divine. And so with Thales, we should understand all is water alongside the assertion that he made that all is full of gods. Everything is full of gods. And so everything being water, everything being full of gods. In other words, the divine was mixed with and understood alongside and interpenetrating the physical world. That gets us closer to polytheism, gets us closer to pre-Socratic philosophy. Now, I said monotheism. We're headed in the direction of monotheism, and what we get with the pre-Socratics are some of the early rumblings that that's where things are headed, in trying to understand things in terms of a single guiding principle. Now, Aristotle identified this with the arche. So arche refers to a first principle, and that's the way that Aristotle thought about the world, was in terms of first principles. And so Aristotle was thinking about, okay, well, what is the principle that underpins all of reality? That's what it is that we're looking for, is this arche, this, first principle from which we can derive the remainder of science. And that's his world. That's not necessarily what was going on, and it seems, at least with Thales especially, it's definitely not what was going on in the way that he thought about the world. So I think that's important for us to realize, that his notion of all is water and his notion that everything is full of gods may point to something closer to monotheism. Now, I'm going to argue as well, by the time we get to talking about Plato, that Plato is also a kind of monotheist, but also the last great polytheist. And so the idea of the good is a guiding principle from which everything else comes. Aristotle would have understood this as the arche. And it is also at the same time a kind of monotheism, a kind of one God that everything else comes from, but at the same time, you also have the polytheism of all the different forms. And anyway, we'll see this with Plato, but with someone like Thales and with someone like Anaximenes, where we have single principles, what seem to be principles. In fact, it may be useful for us to understand these in the context of the transition in the axial age from polytheism and traditional societies' polytheism to the monotheism that we're going to see with ancient Greece, in ancient Egypt, and then of course later in ancient Rome with the emergence of Christianity several centuries later. So I hope that's useful. Now, one of the other things that needs to be said here is that they did not cleanly divorce mythos from logos. In other words, they did not cleanly divorce religion from science, taking it very, very loosely. In other words, reason and story were not necessarily opposed. So reason and myth, reason and religion were not necessarily opposed. Now, we would hear, as a little bit later with Plato, that there was an ancient quarrel between mythos and logos. In other words, they had already been split and had already been seen as in tension and opposed to one another. And that's evidence of the kind of tradition, that's evidence of the kind of thing that was emerging at this point, but was certainly not well formed when we see people like Thales declaring that all is water, which seems to be very philosophical, proto-scientific, etc., and then also that everything is full of gods, which seems to be very clearly religious and clearly on the side of mythos. And so with Thales, these two are much closer together, and the sacred has not been so much divorced from and so much separated from the profane world. So I think that's important. Along the lines of the monotheism question and whether or not we are getting closer to monotheism by having these arche, one of the things that I think we should look at is the emergence of cosmogonic stories. In other words, the emergence of stories where everything derives from a single thing. That's something that we didn't have completely in Homer. Homer does not have a cosmogonic story. This is something that we get later, where you have, all emerging from, chaos, and then through Ouranos and Gaia and the others, and kind of this succession. That succession of, begat, begat, begat is the sort of thing that we get increasingly with societies that are inclined towards monotheism, because it's something where everything traces back to a single principle. In other words, a monos, a one. And it's kind of natural, I think, when you look at it that way, that, oh yeah, okay, well, if you're going to have a theory where everything traces back to a single thing, then that's obviously going to be a kind of predecessor, a kind of fertile ground for monotheism. And indeed, we see those two evolving together, arguably, during this time. So I think that's kind of interesting. Now, I want to round out the discussion of Thales by telling you some of the stories that you're likely to have heard when it comes to Thales. And so Thales, for instance, is famous for falling into a well, where he was looking up at the sky and was so concerned with what was going on up high, presumably in the stars, that he wasn't paying attention to where he was going, and he fell into a well. And we're told that a Thracian servant girl pointed and laughed at him at the stupidity of this philosopher who wasn't watching what was right here and right now in front of him and important right here at eye level in front of him, but was instead concerned with the motions of the heavens. That is, of course, emblematic and is taken to be emblematic of Thales' concern being with what is eternal, being with the stars and astronomy and the gods, and not being as concerned with what's right here, right now, in front of him. And so, anyway, that's an interesting story. It's worth thinking about and worth hearing about that. Now, we also hear about the story of Thales and the olive presses. And I've heard this in a couple of different ways. So one version of the story is where someone tells Thales, okay, well, if philosophers are so wise, if you're so smart, then why aren't you rich? And Thales is said to have responded, well, we could be, philosophers could be rich if we wanted to be. We're just not focused on those things. Here, I'll show you. And so in the next season, he saw that he predicted that there was going to be a bumper crop of olives. But because that wasn't the case now, all of the olive presses were available and were able to be rented out for little to nothing. And so Thales rented out the entire economy worth of olive presses. And so he had a monopoly, and he used that monopoly to control prices when all of a sudden everybody wanted to deal with olives with the bumper crop in the next season and made a lot of money. That's one of the stories that we hear from that. It can also be told in a not-so-nice fashion where he was concerned with money, and that was why he did this, and see, philosophers are corruptible too. But I think the former story is considerably more useful. Okay, now we also hear that Thales predicted an eclipse, and this is something that's much discussed because predicting an eclipse is actually really hard. It's not the easiest thing in the world, and you have to understand how it is that an eclipse is caused, what happens during an eclipse when the day turns to night and the moon goes in front of the sun. You've got to understand what's going on there. And that's not necessarily the most obvious thing in the world, not to mention the fact that the math is not straightforward. It is not that simple to do this. And so you have some people saying, well, he probably predicted it within a year, like he knew that was going to happen within a year, which would already be quite an accomplishment. Or that maybe, he just didn't do it at all. Or he got lucky and, it just happened to happen on the day of this particular battle, which would have been understood as an important auspice. So it was something that was an important sign for what was going on in the battle and what the gods had to say, etc., etc. Anyway, a lot of this is apocryphal, but that's one of the stories that you're likely to hear about Thales. Now, finally, we also hear that Thales measured the height of the Great Pyramids, and he did so using similar triangles. So this is to say that he was well versed in geometry. And this is indeed a story that is likely in the sense that it's the sort of thing that Thales probably would have done, and it's the kind of thing he would have been interested in doing. But we hear two different versions of this story. Now, the one that is the kindest to Thales says that he used something like a staff or a stick, and you measure the shadow. If you measure the shadow of the stick, and you measure that from the center of the pyramid on the ground and the length of the pyramid shadow, those are going to give you two similar triangles. And because they're similar triangles, their ratio is going to be the same. You can then compute the height based upon what you know of the stick and use that to compute the height of the pyramid. Very straightforward if you're aware of similar triangles. However, it may be, and this is one of the versions of the story that we hear, that Thales actually did this the easy way, and he just waited until a certain part of the day. There's a certain time during the day where the length of my shadow on the ground is the same as my height, which means that my shadow is going to be the same as my height. The ratio is 1-to-1. So if you then measure the shadow of the pyramid, that's its height. So that doesn't necessarily require a robust knowledge of similar triangles in geometry, but that's probably the easiest way of explaining it. Who knows what he actually did, but at the very least we can say he was interested in that stuff. It's the sort of thing that he would have been likely to have wanted to do or be involved in. So I hope all of this helps in trying to understand the pre-Socratics and trying to understand Thales, and at least to try to encourage you to think that it's not as simple to understand these guys as we often imagine, or we are easily inclined to want to imagine because of the stories that we are likely to believe. It's a little too easy for us to believe those narratives about them being proto-scientists. So let's do better than that and try and understand how it is that they actually saw the world.